She was 27, and they had long since decided she was finished. Not maliciously, that was the particular cruelty of it. There was no campaign against Miss Philippa Wentworth, no organized effort to diminish her. Society had simply stopped noticing her, the way a room stops feeling a draught once you have lived in it long enough. And what could not be noticed could not, of course, make any demands upon anyone's consideration. She had been on the shelf since 23, a fact stated with increasing frequency and decreasing pretense of sorrow. She had learned to carry it the way one carries a small stone in a coat pocket, unpleasant if thought about, largely irrelevant if not. It was Lady Holt who made the forgetting difficult. At the annual benefactors' dinner of the Royal Northern Charitable Hospital on the 4th evening of November, with candles burning low in their brackets and the port just arrived, Lady Holt looked down the long table toward where Philippa stood, reviewing the dispensary records against the evening service ledger, and said, loudly enough that 5 guests heard her without effort, that it was very sweet of Miss Wentworth to still make the effort. A footman near the sideboard went very still. Philippa did not look up from the ledger. The man at the far end of the table set down his wineglass with a small, deliberate sound. He had not spoken in 20 minutes. He had been watching the room the way a man watches a room, when he is not entirely certain what it will require of him, steadily, without appearing to watch at all. He was the Duke of Ravensmore, and he had, until this moment, addressed perhaps 14 words to anyone present. He addressed 5 more now. Not to Lady Holt, not to anyone in particular, to the middle distance, in the manner of a man stating something he finds slightly tiresome to have to state. Effort, Lady Holt, is generally considered admirable. He picked up his wineglass. He did not look at Lady Holt. He looked at her. For a moment, perhaps 3 seconds, certainly no more, Philippa Wentworth looked back at the Duke of Ravensmore across the length of a candle-lit room. Then she returned to her ledger. He returned to his wine. The dinner resumed. Lady Holt said something to the woman beside her about the quality of the Madeira. The footman resumed breathing. That is where it begins. This is a story about a woman who was told her time had passed, and a man who was quietly running out of his own. It is about what happens when 2 people who have each learned to live at a careful distance from the world are placed by necessity close enough to see each other clearly. And what they find in that clarity they will not be able to give back. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. The city, the hour, whether it is early morning or very late. I read each one, and if this is the kind of story you would like to find again, subscribe. I will be here. The Royal Northern Charitable Hospital was not, by any measure, a beautiful building. It sat on a narrow street in the older part of the city, with the heavy dignity of an institution that had existed long enough to stop caring what anyone thought of its appearance. The stone was darkened by decades of coal smoke. The windows were high and narrow, designed for ventilation rather than light. Inside, the corridors smelled of lye soap and dried lavender, of boiled linen, and something sharper beneath it, something medicinal that had seeped into the plaster over 30 years and could not be washed out. On 49 evenings of the year, Philippa Wentworth found this smell entirely unremarkable. On the 50th evening, when the receiving room was turned over to linen cloths and borrowed candlesticks, and the benefactors arrived in carriages, she found herself noticing it more acutely, the way it persisted beneath the hothouse flowers, and the beeswax, and the scent of too many people in a closed room. Someone had arranged white roses along the mantel, imported and expensive, and slightly past their best, releasing a sweetness that was almost too much in a space that small. The hospital did not disappear when they dressed it up. It was only polite about it. She had managed this dinner for 3 years running, since Dr. Hargreaves had recognized that she was better at tallying dispensary accounts and managing suppliers than he was, and had quietly reassigned her to administrative responsibilities alongside her herbal preparations. She did not attend as a guest. She circulated at the edges of the room with a ledger and a particular expression that caused people to look past her without discomfort, which was, she had found, the most efficient posture available to someone in her position. She had first adopted it at 19, the year she declined a season to care for her ailing father, and had refined it in the years since into something nearly involuntary. The mild, occupied look of a woman who was clearly doing something and could not be expected to require anything of anyone. Lady Holt arrived at 7:30 with 3 guests and the particular energy of a woman who considers all rooms to be, in some essential sense, hers. She was somewhere past 50, dressed in the deep plum that flattered her, and she had an ability to assess a room in seconds that Philippa had always found professionally admirable in a personality she otherwise found difficult. Lady Holt noticed things. She noticed who was there and what they were wearing and what they had said the last time, and what that suggested about their current circumstances, and she filed all of this with an efficiency that would have been impressive in a banker. She simply did not always choose to be kind about what she noticed. The dinner progressed through 4 courses without incident. The Duke of Ravensmore, whom Philippa had been told to expect and whose name appeared on the evening's patron list below a figure that had made Dr. Hargreaves sit down briefly, arrived quietly and was seated at the corner of the long table. He was perhaps 34, dark-haired, with a face that was not quite handsome in the obvious way but was sharply made, prominent bones, a controlled mouth, eyes of a particular deep moss green that in certain lights appeared almost grey, and in others held the colour of water seen through forest shade, fathomless still. He sat at a slight angle from the rest of the table, which she noted as an unusual choice of position for a man of his standing at a formal dinner. He said very little. He ate methodically and without apparent enjoyment, and he watched the room with a steadiness she recognized, because she did it herself, the particular attention of someone who was not relaxing in the social sense of the word, but was managing it. He was drinking his wine slowly. She noticed this because she noticed everything in a room she was responsible for. His glass had been refilled once in 90 minutes. A man that size, at a dinner lasting that long, drinking that little, was either preoccupied or unwell, or both. At some point in the 3rd course, he touched his left breast. The briefest of gestures, 2 fingers pressed lightly through the fabric of his coat, gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. She noted it, filed it in the part of her mind that catalogued medical observations, and moved on with the evening. The port arrived. The candles had burned down 2 inches. The smell of the white roses had grown heavier as the evening progressed, mixing now with the port and the smoke from the fireplace and the particular warm human smell of a room that had been occupied for 3 hours. Lady Holt leaned toward the woman on her left, and in a voice calibrated for intimacy, but deployed at a volume that carried, she said that it was very sweet of Miss Wentworth to still make the effort. At her age, when one thought about it. The quality of the silence that followed was something Philippa had learned to identify. It was the silence of people who have heard something unkind and are calculating whether the social cost of responding exceeds the social cost of pretending they had not heard it at all. The calculation invariably resolved in favor of pretending. 2 guests shifted in their chairs. A woman near the fire found something interesting to consider in her port glass. A young man at the center of the table developed a sudden fascination with the stem of his wine glass. She kept her eyes on the ledger. The figures swam very slightly. She blinked once and steadied them. The paper was crisp under her fingers. She was aware of the precise weight of the pen in her hand, the pressure required to hold it without pressing, the specific sensation of keeping her face entirely composed by committing her attention fully to the numbers before her. The wine glass at the end of the table came down against the cloth with a small sound. Not a slam, nothing so dramatic, simply the sound of a man setting something down with more deliberateness than strictly necessary. Into the silence that followed the silence, in a voice that was neither loud nor particularly inflected, the Duke of Ravensmore said that effort was generally considered admirable. He did not look at Lady Holt. He looked at Philippa. She looked back. She could not entirely account for why. The distance between them was perhaps 15 feet of candle-lit room, and the look lasted no more than 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, she had the distinct and unsettling impression of being seen, not appraised, not assessed for marriageability or social utility or any of the ordinary measures, but simply seen, the way one sees a person when one has no agenda beyond the seeing. His eyes were very steady. They held nothing performative in them, no social message, no calculated warmth, only attention directed and unhurried. Then he returned to his wine, and she returned to the ledger, and Lady Holt began a sentence about Madeira, and the room resumed its ordinary operations. Philippa tallied the dispensary figures twice. Both times she arrived at the same number. She closed the ledger, tucked it under her arm, and went to check on the kitchen for the sweet course, because there was work to be done, and the work did not care about the particular quality of a look exchanged across a candle-lit room, or about the fact that she could still feel it, a faint warmth, precise as a finger mark, 3 hours later, walking home through the cold November dark. She told herself this firmly. It was almost entirely effective. The Duke of Ravensmoor's secretary arrived at the hospital at 10 o'clock the following Tuesday morning with a leather satchel, an expression of polished efficiency, and a document 4 pages long detailing the terms of His Grace's patronage. Dr. Hargreaves received him in the front office with the slight dazedness of a man who had not yet fully absorbed the figure on the letter he had received on Monday, and was still occasionally stopping mid-sentence to think about it. The terms were specific. His Grace would fund the expansion of the cardiac ward, the purchase of 3 additional surgical instruments, and the employment of 2 additional nurses for a period of not less than 2 years, renewable at his discretion. In return, he required a monthly accounting of expenditures, a quarterly medical report on outcomes in the cardiac ward, and a named point of liaison within the hospital who would communicate directly with his office. Dr. Hargreaves assigned Philippa. She learned this at noon, from a note left on her workbench between 2 bundles of dried valerian. She read it once, set it down, read it again, and then went to find Dr. Hargreaves to make clear she had no particular qualifications for the administrative liaison role, and that Mr. Phelps in accounts would serve more naturally. Dr. Hargreaves pointed out that Mr. Phelps could not read a medical report, had no understanding of pharmaceutical records, and had twice miscounted the suture inventory. He then asked her to please close the door on her way out, as he had another letter to write. She closed the door. She was the liaison. The Duke's first visit to the hospital in his official capacity occurred the following Thursday at 2 o'clock, precisely as arranged. Philippa met him in the front corridor with the monthly accounts already prepared in a clean folder and the cardiac ward's admission records from the previous 3 months. He arrived alone, without the secretary or any of the usual accompaniments of a man of his rank visiting an institution, which was the first thing she found unexpectedly interesting about him. He removed his hat in the corridor, tucked it under his arm, and stood for a moment in the particular quality of hospital light, clear, cold, utilitarian, with an expression of mild attention that told her he was already taking in the space around him in a way that was not purely social. He shook her hand with the brief firmness of a man who considered handshaking a functional transaction rather than a social performance. He took the folder she offered, glanced at the first page with the rapid focus of a man who could read figures quickly, and said without preamble that he found monthly accounts insufficient and would prefer fortnightly. She said that fortnightly would require additional staff time to compile. He said he would fund the additional staff time. She said very well. He said he would like to see the cardiac ward. She led him through the corridors, maintaining the appropriate half-step ahead that her role required. He walked beside her without apparent thought for the usual social geometry of such tours, simply placing himself where it was convenient for him to walk, which was at her left shoulder, slightly closer than convention suggested. The corridor smelled of turpentine and coal dust, and the faint overlay of yesterday's medicinal preparations. A patient coughed somewhere behind a closed door. He did not flinch at the sound, which she noted and tucked away. What she noticed more precisely, and registered with the quiet accumulation of the practiced observer, was that he positioned himself consistently so that he could see her face when she spoke. In the corridor this might have been natural. In the ward, where they moved between beds and she turned to indicate various items and figures, it became a pattern. He was always angled toward her. When she turned, he had already adjusted. When she spoke, his gaze tracked to her mouth with a fraction more consistency than was usual in someone simply listening. In the cardiac ward, he moved between the 4 occupied beds with the quiet competence of someone who had been in medical spaces before, not disturbing patients, not requiring introduction, simply looking with an attention that was both thorough and respectful. He asked the ward nurse 3 questions. He asked Philippa too. His questions were specific and betrayed a working familiarity with the conditions he was observing, which a patron of the hospital had no particular reason to possess. She walked him out at 3 o'clock. In the corridor, before he put on his hat, he said that the records she had prepared were thorough and that he would have his secretary write with the revised schedule. She said, "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment. The same quality of attention she had noted at the dinner, steady and without apparent purpose. And then he put on his hat and left. His footsteps were deliberate down the stone corridor, unhurried, the walk of a man who had long since stopped caring whether other people were watching him move. She stood in the corridor for a moment after the door closed. The building smelled of lye soap and valerian. A patient coughed from 2 rooms away. She returned to her workbench and began grinding the next preparation, and she catalogued what she had observed with the same methodical care she applied to everything: the angled positioning, the attention to her face, the questions that suggested more prior knowledge than a patron ought to have, the hand at his chest in the candlelight of the dinner. She did not draw conclusions yet. She observed. That was what she did, and she did it well. The 3rd meeting was not at the hospital. His secretary sent word that His Grace wished to review the previous year's intake reports against the current pharmacy budget, a comparison that required access to the pharmacy archive, which was held in the hospital annex, but also to the Duke's own financial records from prior years, which were held at Ravensmoor House. The logical solution, the secretary wrote, was for Miss Wentworth to bring the hospital records to Ravensmoor House at her earliest convenience, where they could be reviewed together. She went on a Wednesday afternoon, with the archive in a canvas bag and her coat buttoned against November. Ravensmoor House was in the quieter part of Mayfair, a tall Georgian building that had been maintained without ostentation, the stone cleaned, the windows sound, the ironwork intact, but none of the extravagances that some families used to signal their prosperity. A housekeeper met her at the door, a woman perhaps 60, with the careful bearing of someone who had managed a large house for a long time and had strong opinions about how this should be done, and led her through a hallway that smelled of beeswax and wood smoke, and something distantly herbal that Philippa identified after a moment as dried artemisia, tucked somewhere in a vase she could not see. She was left briefly in the hallway while the housekeeper went to notify the Duke. To her left was a closed door, a study she assumed from the quality of light beneath it, and the faint sound of papers. The door was shut, but it was not quite fully shut, and through the gap she could see, before she could properly decide not to look, the spines of books arranged on shelves. Not household books, not the decorative volumes that filled most studies she had entered. Medical texts. She could read 3 titles from where she stood, one on arterial anatomy, one on Lennox's recent work on the chest and its sounds, and one with a German title she could only partially make out, something about the mechanics of the heart's great vessels. There was a large diagram pinned to the wall beside the shelf, a cross-section of the human heart, detailed and annotated in a neat, compressed hand, with measurements marked in both English and French. The door swung open. The Duke of Ravensmoor stood in the doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the door. He pulled it shut behind him with the unhurried competence of a man who had done this before and did not intend to make a drama of it. "Miss Wentworth," he said, "thank you for coming." "Thank you for the carriage," she said, because he had sent one, which she had not expected. He led her to a separate room, the estate office clearly, with ledgers on shelves and a large writing table, and for the next 2 hours they reviewed the figures. He worked efficiently. He spoke precisely. He asked no unnecessary questions and answered all of hers without evasion, except when she asked, with what she believed was appropriate casualness, whether he had a personal interest in cardiology. He said it was a field he found significant. She waited to see if he would say more. He did not. He turned to the next column of figures with the deliberate focus of a man who has answered a question to his satisfaction and considers the matter concluded. What she noticed during those 2 hours was less what he said and more what he did not do. When his secretary appeared briefly in the doorway to pass a message, the Duke did not turn his head toward the sound of footsteps. He turned only when the secretary was already beside him and angled into his line of sight. When a book fell from the shelf behind them, a heavy fall a crack of sound against the floorboards. She startled in the instinctive way, and he did not. Or rather, he did, but half a second later, and he turned in the wrong direction first before correcting. The gap was small. It was also unmistakable to someone who was looking for it. She thought about the position at the dinner, the left shoulder placement in the corridor, the attention to her face when she spoke, the book turned toward the wrong direction before correcting. Her theory was forming. She did not have enough pieces yet to be certain of its shape, but the pieces were accumulating with the patient logic of things that have been present all along, waiting only for the right angle of attention. She thanked him for his time, he thanked her for hers, and she rode back to the hospital in his carriage with the canvas bag in her lap. The carriage smelled of leather and something like cedar, faint and cold from the autumn air outside. She looked out the window at the streets going past and considered what it would mean to be a man of considerable intelligence who was quietly, systematically managing a world going silent around him, and who had been managing it, she suspected, for some time. The fortnightly review in December was held at the hospital, in the small room off the main corridor that served as the administrative office. It was cold, the building's heating was uneven, and this room faced north, and Philippa had learned to wear an additional layer on meeting days. She had also learned to arrive 10 minutes early, to have the figures already laid out and the relevant pages tabbed, because the Duke of Ravensmoor moved through records efficiently, and she found it preferable to keep pace with him rather than ask him to wait. He arrived punctually, removed his coat and sat down across the table from her. They worked through the pharmacy budget in 20 minutes. They reviewed the cardiac ward admissions in 15. They were in the process of reconciling the surgical instrument procurement against the original allocation when Philippa turned to the third page of the prior year's anonymous donor record and stopped. It was not a dramatic discovery. It was a line in a column, then another line in the column above it, and then a pattern across 4 years of records that she had not previously had reason to examine closely. The room smelled of cold plaster and ink, and the faint residue of an earlier preparation she had been grinding that morning. White willow bark, slightly bitter, persistent. The anonymous donor to the cardiac ward had been consistent since 1810. The amounts varied, smaller in the early years, substantially larger in the past too, but the timing was consistent, always the first week of March, always directed specifically to the cardiac fund, never to the general hospital endowment. The total across 4 years exceeded what most patrons gave in a decade. She looked at the figure. She looked at the date the Duke of Ravensmoor had first formally contacted the hospital regarding his patronage, which was March of this year, the same month. She looked at his handwriting on the letter she had retrieved from the file this morning, comparing the careful, slightly compressed letter forms to the notation in the donor ledger from 1810, which was written in a hand that had made no effort at all to be anyone else's. She set the page down on the table between them. She waited. He looked at the page, he looked at her. His expression did not change, but something shifted in the set of his shoulders. A very small movement, a slight adjustment, as though he was settling a weight he had been carrying in a particular way for a long time and had not been prepared to put down. "The cardiac ward does important work," he said. "It does," she said. The endowment was not sufficient to fund it adequately. It was not. He looked at the page again. His left hand was resting on the table, and she saw, because she had been looking for some time now, the faint tremor in his fingers. Not the tremor of age or of cold. Something that moved from inside, involuntary, quickly suppressed when his hand closed briefly and then reopened against the table surface. "I would prefer," he said, "that this remain a private matter." "Of course," she said. He nodded once. He turned to the next page. They continued with the surgical instrument procurement. He did not explain anything further, and she did not ask. But the page with the donor record remained on the table between them for the rest of the meeting, and once, only once, she saw his gaze return to it, and then return to her, and remain there for a moment before he looked back at the figures. She thought about what it meant to have been funding a cardiac ward anonymously for 4 years before revealing yourself as its patron. She thought about the medical texts on the shelves of the locked study, the annotated diagram of the human heart. She thought about the tremor in his fingers, and the way he sat very still when he was not actively reviewing documents, and the way he sometimes touched the left side of his chest, briefly, almost unconsciously, his palm flat for a moment, before his hand would drop and return to the table. She thought about all of this very carefully, piece by piece, on the walk back to her lodgings that evening, through streets that smelled of damp stone and coal smoke and the first edges of winter. By the time she arrived home, the shape of the theory was nearly complete. She did not allow herself to name it yet. Naming a thing too early was a kind of arrogance in medicine, and she had been taught better than that. But she was thinking about it, and she did not stop. The storm arrived in the second week of December, without much warning, and settled over the city with the patience of something that intended to stay. By 8 o'clock in the evening, rain was driving horizontally against the hospital's north-facing windows, and the wards were noisy with it, patients restless, pipes rattling, the building creaking around its old joints in the particular way of buildings that have weathered things before and will weather this as well. The usual small crises of a hospital evening were compounded by the fact that 3 of the night nurses were delayed by the weather and would not arrive until 10. Philippa stayed. She had been about to leave at 7:30 when the ward nurse found her to say that the boy in bed 4 of the children's ward, a 12-year-old admitted 2 days prior with a severe pneumonia, had a fever spike and his breathing was worsening. She put down her coat and stayed. The boy's name was Tobias. He had arrived without parents, brought by a man she now understood to be the Duke of Ravensmoor's head of household, with a letter in the Duke's own hand authorizing all necessary treatment and naming himself as the boy's legal guardian. The letter was precise and thorough in the manner of everything he wrote. Tobias was the son of his deceased cousin, the letter said, and was now in his care. He was to be given every consideration. He was a quiet child, brown-haired with large dark eyes and a watchful quality to him that reminded her uncomfortably of his guardian. He had not asked for anyone in 2 days. He had taken his preparations without complaint, had answered medical questions in short, accurate sentences, and had spent the hours between in a state of still observation that seemed far older than 12. Now at the peak of the fever, with rain beating against the window and the candle burning low on the bedside table, he was asking for his uncle. At 9 o'clock the Duke arrived. He was wet from the carriage. The downpour had apparently begun again the moment he stepped out, and his coat was dark with rain across the shoulders, his hair disordered by the wind. He did not speak to Philippa when he entered the ward. He went directly to the boy's bed, sat down in the chair beside it and took Tobias's hand in both of his own. She watched from the doorway for a moment. She had not seen him be anything other than controlled and precise and professionally distant, and what she saw now was something different entirely. A man sitting in a chair with a sick child's hand in his and no particular expression on his face, except the one that appeared when people had been afraid for some time and were trying not to show it. His back was slightly curved toward the boy. His shoulders, always held with careful precision, were lower, unguarded. She went to prepare the preparation she had been considering for the fever, a compound of white willow bark and dried elderflower, in proportions she had used successfully twice before in cases like this. The preparation room smelled sharply of bark and hot water, and her hands moved through the familiar steps without needing instruction, measuring, steeping, straining, all of it done by the particular intelligence of hands that have performed a task many hundreds of times. She brought it to the ward at 9:30. Jasper Kincaid looked up when she entered, looked at the bowl in her hands with an attention that told her he knew what it was and what it was for, and looked at her face. She said it would not cure the pneumonia, but would reduce the fever enough for the body to rest. He said, "How long?" She said, "An hour, if it works as it has before." He nodded. He helped her administer it to Tobias, who swallowed it without complaint, making a small face at the taste but not complaining of it, and then lay back against the pillow. His eyes were glassy with heat. He said very quietly that it was raining quite hard. "It is," Jasper said. "Will it stop?" "By morning." Tobias closed his eyes. The ward was quiet after that. The rain continued against the windows with a sound like poured gravel. One of the night nurses arrived at 10, took over the primary monitoring, and Philippa moved to the chair on the other side of Tobias's bed, intending to check his temperature again at 11 and then leave. Jasper sat where he was, not speaking, one hand resting on the coverlet near the boys, his gaze on Tobias's face with the fixed attention of someone who has decided this is the one thing in the world they will not look away from. At some point, she was not certain when, because she herself had grown still in the way one grows still in a room that has settled into quiet, she became aware that he was asleep. He had not moved, was still upright in the chair, but his breathing had changed, and his head had inclined very slightly to the left, and the fine-drawn tension that he carried in his face even when composed had softened into something that was simply tired. The rain had eased to a steady pour. The candle on the bedside table had burned itself to a stub and was guttering in its own wax. She should have left. She had enough to do before morning. But the boy's fever had come down. She could see it in the color returning to his face, the loosening of the tightness around his eyes. And she checked Tobias's pulse first, 2 fingers to his wrist, counting. 32 beats in 30 seconds. Satisfactory. The elderflower and willow bark had done their work. She was standing close to Jasper's chair in order to reach across the boy's bed, and in the stillness of the ward, in the close proximity of the small hours, she heard it. His breathing. Not dramatic, not the ragged breath of someone in acute distress. Something quieter than that, and in some ways harder to hear, the slightly effortful quality of lungs working harder than they should to produce a result that appeared from the outside entirely normal. She had heard it in others. She knew what it meant. She did not think about it. Her hand moved, 2 fingers to the inside of his wrist, just below the thumb. His pulse was slow and arrhythmic, not faintly irregular, genuinely, significantly, in a pattern she had read about in texts and had been piecing together from observation for weeks. The second beat where there should be a third, a pause too long, a compensation. She counted for 30 seconds, with the particular stillness of someone who has stopped breathing themselves, in order to listen more clearly. His eyes opened. They looked at each other across Tobias's sleeping form. She withdrew her hand slowly, without haste. Neither of them spoke. In the bed between them, Tobias slept, his breathing easier now, the fever pulling back from the edge. The rain came steadily against the window. The guttering candle found a last reserve and steadied. She said, "His temperature is lower." Jasper said, "Good." She said, "You should sleep properly. There is a room at the end of the corridor." He said, "I am fine here." She left. She walked to the end of the corridor, put on her coat in the dark, and stood for a moment with her back against the wall looking at nothing. Her 2 fingers still held the memory of what they had counted. The theory she had refused to name had named itself, finally, in the pulse of a sleeping man's wrist. She stood in the cold corridor for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she walked home. She did not see him for 3 days. The hospital required other things of her, and the fortnightly review was not until the following week, and there was no professional reason for them to meet. She spent the 3 days doing her work, with what she hoped was her usual efficiency, and probably was, because the work had never yet failed to provide itself in sufficient quantity to occupy her. A preparation to reformulate, a pharmacy order to dispute, a new admission to assess and monitor. She did these things carefully and completely. On the 4th day, she went to the medical library at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, which she had a quiet arrangement with, and which had better access to continental publications than the Royal Northern's small collection. She asked for the Edinburgh Medical Review from the previous 2 years, and she found what she was looking for in the August edition of last year, an article by a Scottish surgeon named McLaren, 42 pages, illustrated with 3 detailed diagrams and a comparative study of 6 cases, written in the precise clinical English of a man who trusted data more than rhetoric. The article concerned a procedure for the correction of aortic stenosis, a narrowing of the great valve of the heart, progressive, invariably fatal without intervention, currently untreatable by any means available in most of England. The procedure was experimental. The results across McLaren's 6 cases were 4 survivals, 1 death on the table, 1 death from infection 3 weeks post-procedure. The odds were not good. The alternatives were worse. She read it twice. There in the library, with rain on the windows and the smell of old paper and lamp oil around her, she made 3 notes in the margin of her own copy. She thought about what she had felt in a sleeping man's wrist in the small hours of a December storm, the arrhythmic count of it, the particular gap between beats. She thought about 4 years of anonymous donations to a cardiac ward. She thought about a diagram of the human heart, annotated in a neat, compressed hand, pinned to the wall of a locked study. Then she had the library make her a clean copy of the article, which she folded into an envelope and placed in her coat pocket. She brought it to the hospital on Thursday to the fortnightly review. They worked through the December figures in their usual efficient arrangement, the table between them spread with columns and totals. When they reached the end, when everything had been tallied and she had made the necessary notations, she took the envelope from her coat pocket and set it on the table. She said she had found it in a medical journal and thought it might be of interest for the cardiac ward. He looked at the envelope. He opened it. He unfolded the pages with steady hands that she watched for the tremor and found only its absence, held still by what she recognized as conscious effort rather than ease. He read. She watched him read. It took 12 minutes. He was thorough, even under what she suspected was considerable internal disturbance. And in those 12 minutes, she counted 3 moments where his jaw tightened very slightly, and 2 moments where his eyes stopped moving, and he was simply looking at the paper without taking anything in, his gaze fixed on a particular word or figure, while he was doing something entirely different inside. He finished. He set the article down. The room was very quiet. Outside, a cart went past in the street, and then there was only the sound of the building around them, the particular breathing of an old institution in winter. He asked, "How long have you known?" She said, "Since the 3rd week." He looked at her. Something happened in his face that she did not have a name for. Not relief, not distress. Something between them that was more precise than either. The particular expression of a man who has been holding a truth at a careful distance for so long that having it acknowledged by someone else arrives as both a loss and a release. The effort of not being seen had cost him something. She could see that now, in the absence of it. He did not look away. Neither did she. The article lay between them on the table like a letter that had already been opened, its contents known. The question now only what would be done with them. He sent his carriage for her that evening at 7:30. There was a note with it, brief, in his compressed handwriting, asking if she would come. She read it twice, set it down, went to the window of her lodgings and looked at the street for perhaps 30 seconds, then put on her good coat and went. He was in the drawing room when she arrived, standing rather than sitting, which she had learned was his way when he was trying to manage something he had not yet decided how to hold. The fire had been burning long enough to warm the room properly, the kind of warmth that settles into the walls and the upholstery and the carpet until the air itself feels deliberate. There was tea on the side table that had not been touched. He turned when she came in, and the housekeeper closed the door behind her, and they were alone in a room that smelled of wood smoke and beeswax, and a cold December evening that had not yet decided to become a clear one. He said, "I have not spoken of this to anyone." She said she understood. He began as she had suspected he would from the beginning, because he was a methodical man, and methodical men cannot approach things sideways. He had been married at 26 to a woman named Cecilia Birch, who was clever and kind, and who had loved him with a directness that he had still not entirely accounted for. They had been married 14 months. They had been for most of those months reasonably happy, not in a grand or demonstrative way, but in the quiet, accumulating manner of 2 people who were discovering they suited each other better than either had expected when the arrangement was first proposed. He had been beginning to understand, he said, what it meant to find someone worth remaining close to. In their 2nd winter together, she had been travelling to visit her sister, when the carriage horses had shied on an icy road and the carriage had gone into the embankment. She had died before the surgeon arrived. He had been riding to meet her. He had been perhaps a quarter-mile behind her, close enough to reach her in time to hold her hand, while the surgeon assessed what could not be assessed in time to change the outcome, not in time to prevent it. not in time to do anything at all except be present for the last 7 minutes of her life. He did not describe this in detail. He stated the facts with the precision of a man who has described things exactly that way to himself so many times that the precision has become its own kind of grief, cleaned and stripped down and still present under the cleanliness, the way cold can be present in a room long after the fire is lit. The diagnosis had come 2 years later, a London physician, then a second opinion in Edinburgh. Aortic stenosis, the valve narrowed, the heart compensating, the compensation a temporary measure that would eventually fail. His heart's way, perhaps, of catching up to what the rest of him had understood on an icy road in the winter of 1812. The Edinburgh physician had told him he likely had 3 years, possibly 4 if he was careful, certainly not more than 5. That had been 2 years ago. He said he had spent those 2 years making arrangements. Tobias, whose parents had died of fever the previous spring, was now in his care, and the guardianship arrangements were nearly complete. The estates were in trust. The hospital endowment had been established before he formally declared his patronage, because he had wanted to ensure it continued regardless of what happened to him personally. He had put his affairs in order the way he managed everything, carefully, systematically, without drama, with a thoroughness that left as little as possible to chance. He said, "I had made my peace with it." She had been listening without speaking, standing near the fire, which she was grateful for because the room had grown somehow smaller as he spoke, or she had grown somehow more aware of the particular dimensions of it, the distance between them, the shape of the chairs, the way the firelight moved on the side of his face. She said, "You had been arranging your own funeral for 2 years." He said, "Efficiently, I hope." She looked at him. He was standing 5 feet away from her, in a drawing room he had presumably spent the last 2 years reducing to an exercise in orderly withdrawal from the world. And he was looking at her with something in his face that had not been there during any of their fortnightly reviews, an openness, raw-edged, the look of a man who has removed a very carefully maintained outer layer and is not entirely certain what the air feels like against the thing beneath it. She said, "Jasper," his name, his given name, which she had never used, which she had not precisely planned to use. The word arrived in the room with a quiet force that surprised her. He looked as if she had placed a hand against his chest. He said very quietly, "Yes." She said, "The article, McLaren's procedure. The odds are poor. The odds are better than the alternative." He was quiet. The fire moved. Outside, the December wind found a gap somewhere in the house and made itself heard briefly before settling back into silence. He said, "I have Tobias to consider." She said, "Which is precisely why the odds are what matter." He said, "I had accepted—" "I know what you had accepted," she said. "I am asking you to consider the alternative." Dale silence, longer this time. She waited inside it without filling it because she had learned, in 6 years of sitting beside the ill, beside the afraid, beside people who had been given a number of days and were deciding what to do with the days before that number arrived, that silence was sometimes the only instrument that worked, and that words, however well-intentioned, could close things that silence would keep open. He looked at the fire. He looked at the article which she had brought with her, which lay on the chair beside the door where she had set it when she came in. He looked at her. He said he would think about it. She said good night. She put on her coat, picked up the article, and left it on the side table beside the untouched tea, because she thought it possible that he would read it again once she had gone, and she wanted it to be there for him to pick up. He stood by the window as she went and did not call her back, and she did not give him cause to, and the door closed behind her with the soft click of something well made and precisely fitted. She walked home through December air that tasted of coal smoke and cold stone, and the particular metallic sharpness of a sky about to snow, and she did not know what he would decide, and she did not allow herself to imagine it either way, because imagining outcomes had never been her strength, and she had long since accepted this as one of the few reliable facts about herself. She received no word for 4 days. She attended to the work. She ground preparations and wrote reports and managed a small crisis involving the pharmacy suppliers and a miscounted shipment of gentian root. She was precise and capable, and she slept adequately and ate adequately, and she did not allow herself to spend more than approximately 20 minutes of each day thinking about the conversation in the drawing room, which was not entirely successful, but was the best she could manage. On the 5th day, she sent him a letter. It was not a long letter. She had written and discarded 3 drafts before arriving at one that contained only what needed to be said. It said that she had written to Dr. Angus McLaren at the Edinburgh Infirmary on a general inquiry, and that she had learned he was currently in London on a teaching engagement at the Royal College of Surgeons until the 23rd of December. If the Duke of Ravensmore wished to arrange a consultation, the timing would not arise again for at minimum 6 months. This was information she was providing in her professional capacity as hospital liaison, as McLaren's work was relevant to the cardiac ward's interests. She remained his obedient servant, etc. She sent it and went back to the Gentian route. His reply arrived the same evening by his own footman. Not a carriage, not the secretary, his own footman, which told her something about the speed of the decision. The letter said that he had no interest in pursuing the procedure, and that he would be grateful if Miss Wentworth would not write to any further surgeons on the hospital's behalf without consulting him first. She read it. She folded it. She sat for a moment with it folded in her hand, looking at the wall above her desk where she had pinned several botanical specimens in various stages of documentation. Dried wood sorrel, precisely pressed. A sprig of mallow, its colour faded from pink to a pale biscuit. Evidence of things that had existed and been preserved. Then she put on her coat and walked to Ravensmore House. He was not expecting her. The housekeeper showed her to the study, the proper study this time, not the estate office, which meant she saw clearly now, without the partially open door, the shelves of medical texts and the diagram of the heart on the wall, annotated in his handwriting in black ink, with additions in red ink that were more recent and somewhat less precise, the hand of someone writing under physical difficulty. She stood in the middle of his carpet with her coat still on and looked at the diagram and did not say anything about it. When he came in and found her standing there, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her with the expression of a man who had not anticipated this particular complication and who was not for once certain how to manage it. She said, "Explain to me with specific reasoning why the risk of the procedure is worse than the certainty of the progression." He said, "I do not owe you an explanation." She said, "No, but you are a man who does things for reasons, and I would like to hear yours." A pause. He crossed the room, not to the desk but to the window, which was his habitual position when he was thinking, standing at a slight angle, looking at the street below with the deliberate focus of a man who finds it easier to think when he has something to look at that asks nothing of him. He said the risk of dying on the table was not negligible. He said that Tobias's guardianship arrangements were not yet fully complete, and that his death during a surgical procedure, without warning, without the time to finalize the remaining legal instruments, could complicate the boy's situation considerably. He said he had made a calculation about the most orderly way to manage what was coming, and that introducing an uncertain surgical variable into that calculation meant introducing a chaos he had not accounted for. She listened to all of this. It was reasonable. It was also incomplete. She said, "You are afraid." He turned from the window. She said, "Not of the procedure, of choosing it and having it fail, of wanting something and losing it. You have spent 2 years making your peace with a certainty, and McLaren's procedure threatens to replace the certainty with hope, which is considerably harder to carry than certainty. You have been very organized, and hope is not an organized thing." He was very still. The late afternoon light came through the window behind him, grey-white, the light of a winter afternoon that had never quite become bright, and it lay across his shoulders and across the floor between them in a way that made the room feel very precise and very quiet. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him, close enough that the window light reached them both equally. She reached out and took his wrist, the way she had done in the ward on the night of the storm. 2 fingers, interior wrist, the count. She felt the arrhythmic pulse of it, the gap, the compensation. She did not count aloud. She simply held it. She said, "Because I would miss you," which is entirely unreasonable given the length of our acquaintance, and I am aware of that, and I am saying it anyway. He looked at her. His wrist was still in her hand. He looked at her face with the particular attention he had always given her, the steady, unperformative focus that had been the first thing she had noticed about him and had not been able to stop noticing since. But there was something different in it now, something that had no precedent in any of the meetings across tables and ledgers and careful professional distances, something that was not calculated. She said, "Write to McLaren, or allow me to do so. The rest, Tobias, the arrangements, I will help you complete before the procedure, if that is what it requires. Give me a list of what remains undone. I am very good at lists." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a carriage went past in the street. The house was quiet around them. No servants within earshot, no clock marking the half-hour yet. He said very quietly, "If I write to McLaren, if we proceed—" He stopped. She waited. He said, "You will stay." Not a question, a request with the form of a statement, which was the most direct form of vulnerability available to a man like him. She said, "Yes." He wrote to McLaren the following morning. Resolution. Dr. Angus McLaren was 61, Scots approximately 5 feet 4 inches in height, and had the disconcerting habit of describing his own procedure with complete equanimity while using language that made most of his listeners want to look away from the diagrams. He met with Jasper and Philippa together because Jasper had asked her to attend, which told her something she filed away in the part of her that was keeping track of what things told her. McLaren examined Jasper for 40 minutes, moving with the efficient thoroughness of a man who has learned to say a great deal with very few words and even fewer wasted gestures. He pressed his ear to Jasper's chest and listened for a long time, and Philippa watched Jasper's face during this, the slight effort of holding still, the controlled patience of someone used to submitting to examination. He asked Philippa several questions about the progression of symptoms she had observed, which she answered with the precision of someone who had been observing carefully, and she saw Jasper's gaze move to her face twice while she spoke, the same quality of attention he always had, and something else beneath it that she did not name. McLaren was quiet for some time after examining his notes. The room smelled of leather and ink, and the particular cold, clean smell of the December afternoon outside. Then he said that the case presented well for the procedure. Not ideally, there was some compensatory thickening that would complicate the approach, but well enough that he would agree to perform it if His Grace wished. He wished. The date was set for the 5th of January. The weeks between the agreement and the date were, in their way, the most ordinary and the most extraordinary weeks Philippa had experienced in some years. She helped Jasper finalize Tobias's guardianship papers. She sat in the solicitor's office for 3 hours one Tuesday afternoon, reading documents with the careful attention she applied to everything, identifying 3 ambiguities that required revision, while Jasper sat across from her, and the solicitor looked between them with an expression of professional neutrality that barely concealed his bewilderment. She managed the hospital liaison, as she always had. She ate her meals in her own lodgings, and slept in her own bed, and did not examine too closely what it meant that the hours she spent in Ravensmoor House, working through the remaining legal instruments, felt more real to her than the hours she spent anywhere else. She had Tobias brought to London for the Christmas fortnight, which meant the house was for 2 weeks a different kind of place, warmer, noisier, smelling of the pine bough Tobias had inexplicably dragged in from somewhere and insisted on placing in the entrance hall, and the boy's particular combination of quiet intelligence and sudden, expansive energy that seemed to catch everyone in the house slightly off guard. She was not present at Ravensmoor House for these 2 weeks, but she called every other day on the pretext of documents, and once she arrived to find Tobias sitting on the floor of the drawing room with a book, and Jasper beside him, also on the floor, reading something entirely separate, the pair of them in companionable silence, while rain ran down the windows, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before either of them heard her come in, looking at the two of them, and at the rain, and at the fire. And she did not move for longer than was strictly necessary. On the 4th of January, the evening before the procedure, she went to the house at Jasper's request. He met her in the drawing room. He was composed, she was composed, and the room smelled of wood smoke and the remainder of the dinner he had eaten without appetite, because the preparation required fasting from midnight, and he had dined early with particular thoroughness in case. He took something from his coat pocket. A watch, gold, heavy, old, worn smooth at the edges, in the way of objects that have been handled consistently for decades, the surface bearing the small impressions of years of use. He held it out to her. She said she would not take it as a farewell. He said, "Then take it so you have something to hold while you wait." She took it. She held it in her palm. It was warm from his pocket and heavy, and it ticked with the small, reliable sound of machinery that had kept accurate time for a very long time and intended to continue. She said she would see him tomorrow. He looked at her in the way he had looked at her across the dispensary ledger and across the hospital corridor and across his own drawing room, the way that had nothing in it of ordinary social calculation and everything in it of a man who is looking at the thing that matters most to him and has stopped pretending otherwise. He said, "Yes." She left. Outside, the January air was sharp and clear, and the stars above the city were very bright. She walked home with the watch in her gloved hand. The procedure took 3 hours and 22 minutes. She spent them in the corridor outside the surgery, with his watch in her hand. She counted its ticks without meaning to. The small, reliable percussion of it, the machinery still running, still running. She had a chair which she used intermittently. She had at one point a cup of tea that someone brought and that she did not taste. She was very cold, even in a warm building, in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air and everything to do with the particular coldness of waiting for something you cannot control. At 11 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, McLaren came out. He said it had gone well. The complication he had anticipated had in fact not arisen. The heart's rhythm was slower than he would like, which was expected, and would likely resolve over several days. His grace was alive, and his grace would, in all reasonable expectation, remain so. She said, "Thank you." She sat back down in the chair. The watch was still in her hand. She looked at it for a long time, feeling the warmth of it now. Her own warmth returned to it after 3 hours of holding, and she did not feel anything in particular, which was how she knew she felt a great deal. Outside the window at the end of the corridor, the January sky had cleared to a pale, clean blue, the kind of blue that arrives after storms and looks, for a day or two, like evidence that the world intends to continue. Epilogue. 3 years later, on a Wednesday morning in early March, the breakfast table at Ravensmoor House held a pot of cooling tea, 2 cups, 1 unread newspaper, and a half-finished botanical illustration of a specimen from the kitchen garden, an early primrose, the first of the season, which she had been documenting for a collection she had agreed to contribute to, not for the Royal Society at their initial terms, but on revised terms that had required 3 separate conversations and a considerable amount of patience on everyone's part. She had been working on the illustration since 7:30. It was now 9:10, and it was nearly right, though the shadow under the lower petals required a finer line than she had achieved with the current brush. The room smelled of tea and wood smoke, and the particular dry-clean smell of paper and ink that she had come to associate over 3 years with mornings that were essentially good. She was aware of being watched. She looked up. Jasper was sitting across the table with the newspaper folded in front of him, unopened, as it had been for the last several minutes at minimum. He was looking at her. When she looked back, he did not look away, which he had stopped doing some time ago, somewhere around the 3rd month of his recovery, when he had apparently decided that the social convention of looking away when caught looking had not served him particularly well in life and could be safely retired. She said, "You are staring." He said, "I have a habit of it." She waited. He said, "Of watching the things I nearly lost." She looked at him for a moment, at his face, which was less drawn than it had been 2 years ago, at the steadiness of him, at the particular quality of his attention that had been the first thing she had noticed and that had not changed. And then she returned to the illustration, because the lower petal shadow was not yet right, and it required attention. But she did not attempt to suppress the thing that moved across her face while she looked at the paper, because there was no one watching her brushwork except possibly him, and he had, by this point, already seen considerably worse. From the hall they could hear Tobias, home from Edinburgh for the fortnight and considerably louder about it than the previous visit, arguing with the footman about whether the new dog had been promised the run of the house or only the lower floor, a distinction the dog was currently declining to observe. The argument had been proceeding for approximately 10 minutes and showed no sign of resolution. Tobias's voice had acquired over 3 years an authority somewhat beyond his 15 years, which Jasper regarded with the expression of a man who recognizes something he himself once had and is not entirely certain how to feel about it being visited upon him from this direction. The house smelled of pine sap and beeswax and tea, and from somewhere below the warm bread smell of the kitchen in the morning, and the faint green smell that came through the window she had cracked open to the March air outside, the smell of soil and new growth and the first morning of a world returning to itself. On the table between them, within reach of her hand and within reach of his, the pocket watch rested in the morning light. It ran precisely. It had done so for 26 years and showed no sign of stopping. McLaren had visited last month for the annual review. He had listened to Jasper's heart for a long time, as he always did, with the expression of a man who is making very precise notes on the inside of his own head. He had said that the progression had halted as far as he could determine, and that the heart appeared to be managing itself with a competence that he found, frankly, more impressive than he had predicted. He should continue the preparations. He should rest when he was tired, which he did somewhat more reliably now than he used to. He should, McLaren had added, with the dry satisfaction of a man who has lived long enough to see things go right, continue doing whatever it was he was currently doing, because it appeared, medically speaking, to be working. She had not told McLaren what he was currently doing. That was not a medical matter. It was something else entirely, and it was hers. She looked up again. Jasper was still watching her. The newspaper remained folded. Outside, Tobias and the footman had apparently reached an accommodation with the dog because the argument had subsided into what sounded like the considerably more peaceful sounds of a large animal being admitted to somewhere it wanted to be. She said, "Jasper." He said, She said, "The primrose is nearly right." He said, "Show me when it is." She returned to the lower petals. The shadow required a finer brush and a lighter hand, and the particular patience of someone who has learned that most things worth doing require more time than one initially allows for them, and that the additional time, more often than not, is what makes the difference. Outside, the March light came through the tall windows, warm and unhurried, laying itself across the table and the illustration and the watch and the 2 cups of tea and the newspaper that would wait, as all things eventually learn to wait, for its moment. A dog's nails clicked somewhere below. A bird made a single clear sound from the garden and was briefly answered, and then the morning went on, as mornings do, in the manner of something that intends to continue. Stories told with quiet love.
In a room full of silence, I learned to disappear, invisible in the candlelight, invisible in fear. But your eyes found me gently in a glance so true. For the first time in forever, I felt seen by you. And the walls I built around me started falling one by one, like the wind turning softly into something warm undone. You saw the heart I hid so well, beneath the silence I couldn't tell. And in your eyes I finally found a love that lifts me off the ground. No need for words, no need to explain. You held my heart, you held my pain, and in this fragile beating star, you became the home for my heart. In the rain, in the shadows, in the quiet became the